Today, we're ranking all 13 cities in New Hampshire to visit, from worst to best. While I can't advise you on the best places to live in New Hampshire, this list will generally be reflective of how interesting these cities are. If you live nearby, it's easy to visit all of them, but some are clearly better than others. So let's start with the worst one, which, unfortunately, is Lebanon. Looking at the map, it doesn't seem so bad, since, as usual for New England, there's a central green, and everything else is based around it. But go in person, or zoom in, and you'll see it just doesn't work in this case. There actually isn't much around the green, and everything was inexplicably closed when I visited in the middle of the summer. The main roads leading into the green also had to swirl their way in, making the layout of everything else rather odd, and the whole place was empty and not interesting. It almost looks as if they just punted, and instead tried to develop the neighborhood along the Connecticut River, about 3 miles to the west. But that surely isn't anything to write home about either. Oh well. So next, we head to Strafford County, to a city that really should be better. Rochester. This is in the interesting area where the Piscataqua and Salmon Falls rivers form the border between New Hampshire and Maine, but you would have never guessed that if you were here. Downtown is nowhere near the border river, and the Cocheco River that runs through town is barely incorporated into the city structure, at least compared to comparable cities. And downtown is completely bland and uninteresting compared to the others in the state. But perhaps then, I see this as good potential for improvement. That's a nice way to put it, right? Keene is a fine place, and it's set up like a nice New England town, but it's just not that interesting in terms of cities. It's set up in the classic triangular layout, with the green in the center, and there's a slightly larger town feel, but that's about it. It is the only city in the southwest corner of the state, so that's nice and different, I guess. But that does mean the city is a thoroughfare in the area, and as you can see by the road map, there are a number of large roads that bypass the main part of town, so yeah, it does seem like drive-through territory for many people. Somersworth sits between Rochester and Dover in Strafford County, right on the border with Maine along the Salmon Falls River. It's way smaller than the other cities around it, but the center of town does actually sit right on the river, right across from Berwick, Maine's downtown. Now, the river isn't large or picturesque whatsoever, but this does actually give the city some constraints and makes it more interesting. It seems to function better as a small, walkable downtown in that regard. But that's about it. I'd still pick other cities in this region ahead of this. Claremont sits along the Connecticut River at the state's western edge, about 19 miles south of Lebanon, and similarly, it's centered on the town green a couple miles inland of the big river. But this city is considerably better put together. There's actually a main street that lasts for a couple of blocks, that being Pleasant Street, and the central neighborhoods flow more smoothly into the section directly to the west. And the small Sugar River is better incorporated into the town, with bridges connecting right into downtown, a pedestrian bridge, a couple small parks, and interesting sites of mills and factories, as if it was the Merrimack Valley. Again, it's pretty small otherwise, but this is New Hampshire after all. Speaking of the Merrimack River, we now head to the second largest city in the state, Nashua. Now, this is the only city in the state that sits on the border with Massachusetts, right next to the Lowell metropolitan area. And the entire southern half of the city is a sprawling suburban zone, even though that doesn't carry into Massachusetts at all, which is an odd situation. Anyway, downtown sits on the Nashua River, and it's really just okay. The residential areas to the north and south are fine, but the center of town doesn't seem to efficiently use its space. Lots of parking lots, things are a little spread out, and it's pretty one-dimensional, just relying on Main Street to look grand, which it isn't. It's kind of interesting to see the old industry and warehouses along the Nashua River, but it's disappointing that they couldn't incorporate the larger river, the Merrimack River, into the main part of town whatsoever. Zero waterfront parks or river access, except for the bridge into the neighboring town of Hudson. It's like they forgot the river even existed when they planned the city out. Dover is certainly not one of the nicer cities you'll see, but it's kind of the classic charming New England small city. It's also along the border with Maine on the Piscataqua and Salmon Falls rivers, but the main town sits on the small Cocheco River. And like some of the others on this list so far, there are some interesting sights and sounds pertaining to old industry along the river. It's a classic triangularly shaped downtown, constrained by the valley, with all kinds of curvy roads leading into and out of town, making navigation quite difficult. But there's way more access to these rivers and waterways, even if they're not downtown. But it's better than nearby Rochester and Somersworth, that's for sure. Laconia is centrally located in the state, and it's most notable for sitting between Lakes Winnisquam and Winnipesaukee, with a couple smaller lakes, which they call bays, between them. And while there aren't tons of parks along these lakes, there are a few parks, beaches, and access points to all of them sprinkled around. Downtown is again just okay, and it appears to be super designed in a sense, in a way similar to Caribou, Maine. But it's kinda nice, and it sits on the Winnipesaukee River, and it generally seems like a homely place. Now, it's not a short hike from lake to lake. It's about 5.5 miles from downtown to Weir's Beach on Lake Winnipesaukee, so it almost feels like going to another town altogether. But this clearly is a likable part of the state, and Laconia is certainly the anchor of it all. We head all the way up north to Coos County, to the only northern city in the state, Berlin. This city is surely different from the others in the state, being so far north, only 35 miles from the Canadian border. It sits on the Androscoggin River, which is small at that point, and it's completely surrounded by mountains, making it very isolated, aside from its neighboring town, Gorham. Downtown does have some vacant lots, but I think it's well set up considering how remote it is. Some of the development in town follows the river valleys and contour of the hills, so there's no sprawl. It's a well-contained city. There is a pipeline flowing right behind the buildings downtown, but hey, you don't see that everywhere. And of course, there are access points to great outdoor activities, and the famous Mount Washington is only about 15 miles to the south. Is it worth trekking all the way north to get here? Not sure, but it is worth stopping into if you're in the area already. We now head to another city in the central part of the state, to Franklin. Franklin is 10 miles west of Laconia, and it sits at the mouth of the Winnipesaukee River, where it meets the Pemigewasset River to form the more well-known Merrimack River, which we've already talked about. Now, some of you might disagree with ranking this higher than Laconia, since it doesn't have the lakes, but the town itself seems nicer. The downtown is charming and sits on a gradual hill, the residential district to the south is kind of nice, and the small rivers are incorporated well into the town's layout. There are parks, mills, small bridges, bike trails, and the whole place just seems more picturesque than Laconia. I've only been to each of these places twice though, so I'd be interested to hear if you all agree. Let me know in the comments which of these cities you prefer. The top 3 is pretty obvious though. Let's start with number 3, Concord, the capital. As far as capitals go, it's not grand whatsoever, but it's pretty nice and simple in terms of layout, and there are plenty of nice things in town. Main Street is very nice, and the capital itself is pretty small, but appropriate considering the size of the state and city. And the other main government buildings are right behind, and they also don't take up a ton of space, keeping the small city kind of feel. And there are some other interesting spots like White Park and Bicentennial Square right behind a row of businesses downtown. But generally, it's an easy city to navigate, and it's not generally overwhelming until we talk about the roads. The biggest weakness of this city is the waterfront. Interstate 93 cuts the entire main part of the city off from the Merrimack River, and even if it didn't, there are shopping malls and shopping centers blocking the river access as well. Not sure what they were thinking here. Also, there's the odd Interstate 393, which crosses the river to the eastern side of town that doesn't go very far. I'd recommend watching the channel Beaver Geography, who talks about this roadway in some of his videos. But even with all that, I'd still recommend you visit this city to see the capital of New Hampshire and explore for yourself. Okay, that just leaves 2 cities to talk about. If you know New Hampshire well or live there, you probably know which one will be ranked number 1. So let's first talk about number 2. Manchester, the largest city in the state. And it sure feels like the biggest city in the state. It has the largest downtown, the tallest buildings, the largest urban layout, the largest historic industrial area, and one of the larger infrastructures. And this city, unlike some of the others nearby, actually makes good use of its largest natural feature, the Merrimack River. The waterfront parks are not overly great, but there are modest river walks and access points to the river, as it goes through the rapids and mills of the area. There's an interstate highway along the river, but it's on the other side, that being the west side. And there's actually a well-connected west side neighborhood that is gridded and has its own unique feel to it, and it's connected to the main part of town by 4 bridges and a pedestrian bridge. Now, as for the main part of town, downtown runs along Elm Street for arguably a mile and a half, from approximately the SNHU arena to the south to Salmon Street to the north. Businesses are abundant, both on Elm Street and many of the side streets east to Chestnut Street. But then just to the west of Elm Street is where you'll find the extensive old industrial area. But this is actually one of my favorite parts, since you have all these magnificent buildings that have almost all been repurposed. You have all kinds of things occupying these buildings now, like residences, apartments, shops, breweries, restaurants, academic facilities, offices, museums, and even still a few active industrial uses. The Merrimack River is known for having old industrial zones like this, especially in Massachusetts, but this feels like one of the more grand ones, with little to no derelict parts. Now, to the east of downtown and Chestnut Street lies a pretty substantial grid of mixed-use but mostly residential streets, which isn't overly unique, but it does help to make this a really well-put-together city. Also noteworthy is that I can count at least 10 block-wide parks in this part of town, and I'd say this can be a really enjoyable place to visit. Of course, a city like this won't have the grandeur or hustle and bustle of a place like, say, Boston, but for New Hampshire, I can definitely recommend this place. And lastly, the #1 city to visit in New Hampshire is Portsmouth. This is right on the border with Maine, right by the mouth of the Piscataqua River. It's effectively on the Atlantic coast, except for being entirely guarded by Newcastle Island. Portsmouth is one of the original 4 towns in the state, and it sure feels like the most historic city in New Hampshire. Many of the downtown buildings have old and vintage aesthetics, as well as many of the houses in the south end. In fact, right in this area is the outdoor museum known as Strawberry Bank, where there are 17 historic homes right there in one of the oldest neighborhoods from the colonial era. Now, the main part of town is bounded by the Piscataqua River to the east, or northeast, whatever you want to call it, and to the north and south by the North and South Mill Ponds. The North Mill Pond is less interesting, as there's very little around it, except just north of it are the Jackson House and the USS Albacore Submarine Museum. The South Mill Pond is more incorporated into the historic districts, and it has jogging trails and 2 lakefront parks, including the sports park at the inland end. But be ready, because in the summer, you might hear a lot of this.
It is an absolute chorus of these. You hear what I mean? It's a chorus of them.
But as for the Piscataqua River, there are 4 waterfront parks, 3 of which are incredible, like Pierce Island and 4 Tree Island, but most of all, Prescott Park, just a few steps from downtown. Not only is it set up nicely along the river, but the gardens are excellent as well. Downtown is packed with all kinds of things, and it's very lively, and many people are walking out and about, even at night, and it's a really charming place. Businesses and places of interest are lined up on State Street, Congress Street, Hanover Street, Market Street, Pleasant Street, and Bow Street right along the river, and there is a lot to explore around. Then, there are interesting smaller streets, alleyways, and a pedestrian mall that's sort of overlooked. The main part of town continues inland as far as US 1, and this part of town is pretty usual for New England. Right in sight from town is the naval base on Seaveys Island in Maine, and there's an old Air Force base on the far western side of town. There are 3 bridges into Kittery, Maine, including the one right downtown that also connects to Badgers Island, and 2 of them are lift bridges, including the unique Sarah Mildred Long Bridge, which historically has also had to account for a lower level for rail freight. Now, I'm not a fan of the outskirts of town, which has industrial and strip mall development, but just like most of New England, every part of land is incorporated into towns or cities, so this falls within the Portsmouth lines, and that's how it goes. I'd say my favorite other things in town are the 4-way intersection at Congress, Pleasant, Daniel, and Market Streets, Goodwin Park on the inland side of downtown, the Powder House, and the back side of the buildings on Bow Street along the river, especially at sunrise. There's no doubt why this place is a popular tourist destination in the summer, and it's a completely opposite character to places like Manchester, or really anywhere else in the state. As most people know, New Hampshire's coastline is very short, and this isn't technically on it, but there are a few absolute gems in this region, and I hope you agree that this is surely the pinnacle of it all. Well, I hope you enjoyed the tour and these rankings, and please let me know how you would rank these 13 cities in the comments. Is Portsmouth the best city in New Hampshire? If not, which would you pick? How many of these have you been to? We'll be back with more content soon. Thanks for watching.